Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. Today I am so excited to talk to you about horror classics that are actually worth reading. So I have 5 horror classics that I think you should explore if you are looking for your next classic read. The reason I think classics are so exciting to read is that you get to see where the genre started. All of these books do something new that added something to the horror genre as a whole. So even if you're not a huge horror book fan, if you like horror movies or horror television, I think these books are all worth reading to kind of see the origins of the genre we all love so much. So the first book that I want to talk about is one that I've already talked about before, and it is The Haunting of Hill House by Shirley Jackson. I love this book, and I cannot overemphasize how incredible of a read this one is. In this book, Eleanor is called to participate in a research study at the infamous Hill House, where she and the other participants will be studied for their psychic abilities. I like this book a lot because I feel like it has a lot of things going for it. It's very, very subtle in its horror and the way that it's written. Because we have such an unreliable narrator in Eleanor, I really feel like you question a lot of whether or not what is happening to her is really happening to her or if she's actually just crazy. Because Eleanor is such an unreliable narrator, not only is this a supernatural horror book, but it's also a psychological horror book. You really, really question reality in this book, the way that Eleanor perceives it. I really love the trope of, is this place actually haunted or is she just insane? And this book definitely has that in abundance. While it is literary in nature, this book I think is very easy to read and to understand what's going on. By literary in nature, I mean that it's definitely written like a classic, where it is not written using very common English. So overall, pretty easy to follow, even though it does have that literary twist to it, where there's a lot of description, there's lots of dialogue, there's lots of moving in and out of the present, and what's actually happening in the storyline. This is usually my biggest turnoff to classics, but I feel like this one stays away from being too pretentious. I feel like the descriptions in this really add to the story and to the characters, and when she pulls us out of that storyline to talk about the past, I feel like it's very clear when she's doing that, and it's also very clear when we tune back into the present day. It's no wonder that this book has been adapted into so many television shows, books, and movies, because there is so much here to work with. Next up is not really a book, but more of a collection of short stories and an author. And I think that if you're looking to explore classics in a very easy way, you should definitely check out the stories of Edgar Allan Poe. Specifically, I have 3 short story recommendations that I want to recommend to you. Specifically, I want to recommend The Fall of the House of Usher, The Cask of Amontillado, and The Raven. In The Fall of the House of Usher, a man gets a letter from one of his former best friends urging him to come to the Usher Manor at once as his sister is on her deathbed. When he gets there, he realizes that things are not quite as they seem, and the short story goes on from there. Now, The Raven is technically a poem, but it is about a man who is haunted by his former lover and a raven who suddenly appears on his fireplace. And lastly, The Cask of Amontillado. In this book, a man lures his best friend into the catacombs with the promise of a cask of Amontillado. And because it's Edgar Allan Poe, you know it descends into horror from there. I think these 3 poems and short stories are Edgar Allan Poe's best. What I particularly like about them is the horror is very clear. Even though they were written in the 1800s, they are still horrific even to this day. They're also very easy to engage with. Again, I talked about that literary in nature thing. This one is written in like older English, but I don't feel in a way that makes it impossible to understand. I'm a huge Poe fan, so I think that almost all of his stories are worth reading, but I really enjoyed these 3 in particular. Again, I think the horror elements are still super strong there, which make it worth the read. Next, I have a more modern classic, and that is Haunted by Chuck Palahniuk. So this book is about a group of authors who are invited to a remote cabin lodge for a writer's retreat, and they are then locked in and told that they will not be let out until they write their magnum opus. This one is written kind of in free verse, where it goes back and forth between like a feature on one of the writers there, and then what's happening in the mansion, and what's happening to a writer, and then what's happening in the mansion. And it goes back and forth through all of this. Fair warning, this one gets a little bit weird if you've read it. The Pool Story, if you know, you know. I found this one because I was looking to read more classic horror, and so I googled classic horror, and this one showed up. And it was written in 2005, which really intrigued me that this book, even though it was written only 10, 15, now 20 years ago, is already considered a classic. It must be worth my time. And I would say it definitely was. If you are okay with a little bit of weird, then I think this one is a great read for you as well. Anything written in modern day that's already considered a classic, I think is worth the read, and I definitely don't see getting I definitely don't see this one getting as much love as I see some other stuff on this list. So if you're looking for something a little bit new, which makes it super easy to read, a quick pace because of how short the chapters are, and a generally weird and horrific read, this one is totally for you. Next up on my list is Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. I have a bit of a confession with this one. I was supposed to read this in the summer before I took AP Lit, and I definitely just read the first half of it and figured, I know the story. I'll be just fine. That is the story of how I failed my first test. So this one's a classic, you know how it is. It's been adapted into so many different movies, television, books, etc., so you know how this one goes. But just in case you don't, Victor Frankenstein wants to discover the secret of life, and in doing so, reanimates a corpse who then wreaks havoc on the village he lives in and in his personal life. Again, I think it's worth reading a book that is the source material for so many incredible adaptations. Not only did this book create the science fiction and the horror genre in general, and it has had a huge impact on horror movies in general. After all, the first female horror villain is the Bride of Frankenstein, to be depicted in film anyway. I think it's worth discovering on your own what about this story makes it still relevant almost 200 years later. Because it was written so long ago, this is a bit more of a challenging read. Again, literary in nature, lots and lots of descriptions, pulls you in and out of the narrative to talk about the past and the present. So be prepared for that as you go in, but I definitely don't think it's something that you should be intimidated by and thus not read. Since you kind of know the general story and where this is heading, it does make it easier for you to understand. Or if you end up reading a page and you're like, wait, I don't understand what they said there, either you can reread it or you can kind of be safe in just knowing that you can flip to the next page and keep going. So in that regard, it is kind of a safe read. Next, I want to talk about The Turn of the Screw by Henry James. In this one, a governess accepts a position to care for and teach two young orphan children at a remote manor. She later discovers the two children are being haunted, literally and figuratively, by events in the manor's past and desperately seeks to free them from evil. This is probably the shortest recommendation I have on here besides the short stories. So if you're looking for something quick, go ahead and give this one a shot. So this is a classic example of Gothic horror, but more than that, I think this is a good bridge between Gothic romance and Gothic horror. So if you like books like Wuthering Heights or Jane Eyre, this would be a great book to read to try to see if you like Gothic horror. A lot of the elements of Gothic horror and Gothic romance are the same in this one. Young woman, remote manor, strange characters. What more could you ask for? This is another unreliable narrator story, so it really plays up on the fact that you don't really know what's happening. Is the main character going insane because she's on such a remote location, or is there really something here that is haunting these children? This is another one that has been adapted by Mike Flanagan in The Haunting of Bly Manor. Almost everything on this list except for Haunted and Frankenstein have been adapted by him, so you can tell if he loves these books, you're probably gonna love them too. I also think The Turn of the Screw, while being a classic horror, isn't one that people still talk about today, so if you're looking for an underground classic, I think this one would be great for you. So there you have it. There are my 5 horror classic recommendations that I think you should give a read. I think it's really cool to read the source material for so many incredible horror books, movies, and television shows. That alone makes these worth reading to me. I also think not many of these are talked about as frequently as I think they should be, and so I would love more people to be reading these and talking with these and engaging with these even more than 200 years later. Let me know in the comments below which one of these you've read and your thoughts, and if there are any other horror classics that you think people should be giving a chance. Thank you so much for joining. I'll see you later.